attention of the moderator. With that, I would like to hand over to Her Excellency, the Botswana High Commissioner to the Republic of South Africa, Mrs. Tenolo Modise, who will then be followed by Dr. Martin Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, Director of Ceremonies, Dr. Martin Davis from Deloitte, South Africa, and your team. BITC CEO, Mr. Uli Bile, and your management team, captains of industry, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to have been invited to welcome you all to this automotive-themed webinar, whose focus is to interest auto sector investors in the region and beyond in expanding their operations into Botswana. The webinar, a joint collaboration between the Botswana Investment and Trade Center, BITC, and Deloitte South Africa, comes at an opportune time when preliminary studies indicate that a significant number of inputs, of up to about 60% actually, destined for the South African auto industry are still being imported from outside Africa. Now, given Botswana's proximity to the Republic of South Africa, we see this as an opportunity for the country to partner and vertically integrate into the ever-growing South African auto value chain, which is expected to grow and actually double its output by the year 2035. We as Botswana are confident that we can comfortably host and provide a base for some of the component manufacturers who wish to supply the auto industry in South Africa. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we in Botswana have no shadow of doubt that our country can offer this service. After all, the government has put in place an enabling environment to facilitate the attraction of, oh, I'm sorry, something happened here. To facilitate the attraction of foreign direct investment and to equally ensure that the domestic sector flourishes or thrives in the country. As a country, we are committed to do and not just give lip service to the attraction of foreign direct investment, because we view this as a vehicle to not only diversify our economy from over-reliance on mineral revenue, but to create a sustainable job opportunities for our population, and thus assist in reducing the current 24.5% unemployment rate. Today's webinar dovetails very well with the recently announced commitment by the Ministry of Investment and Trade to attract 32 manufacturers to set up in Botswana by the end of the financial year 2022. The doing business reforms, which are currently underway, are also aimed at further improving our investment offering as a country. They are also testimony of our resolve and commitment to the attraction of foreign direct investment and thus stimulating economic development. From this seminar, together with the past and future engagement with yourselves, we hope to, amongst other things, target auto component producers outside Africa, as 60% of components, as I just alluded, as 60% of components destined for the Republic of South Africa auto industry are still being sourced from outside the continent. We also wish and hope to initiate a dialogue with original equipment manufacturers in the Republic of South Africa to urge them to onshore in Africa, notably in our country, Botswana. We also wish to target replacement parts manufacturers for the after-sales market. And here we're talking about bulbs, things like bulbs, windscreen bumpers, brake pads, car batteries, etc. To consider using Botswana as a base to export to the SADC, to the SACU, and to the Africa FTA markets, particularly with the advent of the Kazungula Bridge in the northern part of Botswana, as well as the envisaged one-stop border facility in that area. Finally, we want to target truck and bus parts assembly companies to onshore in Botswana as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, with those few remarks, allow me to once more welcome you to today's webinar and wish you a fruitful deliberations. I also want to assure you, those of you who desire to expand it into Botswana, and I'm sure there will be many, that my office, together with that of the BITC here in South Africa, stands ready to facilitate and support you in the process of setting up in Botswana. We are also prepared to continue to engage with you should you desire to do so. So I thank you very much for your attention. Pula. Dr. Davis, my hand over to you, please. Thank you very much.
Hi, Commissioner Modise, thank you very much for the kind introductory words. And welcome everybody. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Just some very brief overview remarks from myself. Deloitte has been working, actually recently published 2 weeks ago at the World Economic Forum's Davos Dialogues, quite a substantive piece of research we've been working on for over 6 months. And it talks to the potential for creating and building automotive value chains in sub-Saharan Africa. My colleague Harsha Desai was one of the prime authors of it. She'll be in the panel session coming up shortly. And the findings of it were as follows. And this talks to, we've been doing a lot of work in the automotive sector and automotive components sector in recent years, alongside the AAAM, the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers, which is a industry representative body of leading automotive OEMs, of leading supplier companies, components companies, and industry bodies representing the automotive industry. We've been engaging with, the AAAM has been engaging with quite an array of African governments to seek to industrialize and to build automotive industry in key particular target countries. Now, why is this of, we believe, and I don't want to overuse this word, it often is, but true strategic industrial importance for our continent? We know that African economies are very thin when it comes to industrialization. We also have the burning issue of our time, undoubtedly, is inequality. My starting argument often is that, in the words of Danny Roddick from Harvard, is that industrialization is almost an escalator to development, a fast escalator to development. Why? There's no sector like manufacturing that creates structural employment, very, what we call in South Africa, decent jobs at least, value add, export driven, demand for services, and can really scale and embed IP in an economy. However, industrialization is difficult. It isn't a policy switch, and Botswana knows this all too well, as does South Africa. It's not a policy switch, it's a generational undertaking, a generational play, if you will. So how do we shape public policy that's in favor towards attracting the foreign direct investment, which the High Commissioner spoke to, but at the same time embedding truly sustainable manufacturing in the auto space in our economies? Africa as well, unfortunately, often is a dumping ground for cheap product coming in, second, third-hand product, cars, components coming in from distant markets. And that is a force for deindustrialization. First and foremost, public policy needs to be in place, trade policy, to be able to restrict these imports under certain parameters to allow an enabling environment for industry to grow. I think that is something which many countries have started to realize, and taking a more proactive policy or proactive approach towards shaping trade policy, whilst at the same time supporting industrial policy. And that's something which will come through in the conversations this morning. South Africa, between Morocco and South Africa, arguably, there's not much in terms of deep industrial automotive supply value chain. Botswana is very well positioned, of course, and it has been succeeding in attracting a number of automotive components companies into the country, supplying into the South African automotive industry. The real question is, how does Botswana scale this, create greater value generation, greater jobs generation, but at the same time, of course, this is taking place in an era of an enhanced automation, increased technology adoption, what is commonly known simplistically as the fourth industrial revolution, and more on that later. So where does the opportunities lie? Where are the challenges around shaping public policy to be able to deepen one's automotive value chain in Botswana? My last comment is, I think of all, the word manufacturing or industrialization is a very wide term, but of all the sectors that I've observed, the most proactive, I would argue, in terms of the continent, in terms of getting business and government to work together, or even industries where, in highly competitive industries, where competitors, companies can work together ultimately to start to shape markets for greater developmental good, is the automotive sector. And we've seen this in countries like Ghana, increasing countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, countries which the AAAM and Deloitte and all its relevant members and stakeholders have visited in recent times, working with governments, working with ministers, heads of state, to try and conceptualize the future around automotive manufacturing to service what is a very, very underserved nascent consumer market for new automotives in our part of the world. So that's just my opening remarks. I'd like to hand over to Kels Olebile, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Botswana Investment Trade Center. BITC is at the sharp end of conceptualizing and driving strategy around automotive, not just automotive, of course, but particularly automotive investment attraction and deepening value add in the automotive value chain in Botswana. Kels, over to you. We have 10 minutes or so, and then we'll go into our interactive panel discussion thereafter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that elaborate opening statement on latest developments around auto components manufacturing, future opportunities that we see. Let me also thank Her Excellency the Ambassador Memodise for the opening remarks. Yes, I think just to continue with thinking, Martin Davis, that we tend to find ourselves quite frequently these days engaging in this sort of subject matter because of how Botswana has taken seriously the attraction of particularly auto components manufacturers. The strategy of our country is that we tend to pursue what we call regional value chain linkages or cross-border value chain linkages, which facilitates collaborative competition between our countries and makes sure that the region can really grow together. So in that regard, I will be presenting just briefly in 10 minutes the value proposition of Botswana. It's quite a detailed set of slides, but I will just cut to the chase, knowing that we can share with our participants for their spare time reading. This slide basically gives the high-level macroeconomic indicators of Botswana, our GDP performance as at 2019. Of course, when you factor in the effect of COVID, we anticipate a slight decline of 7.7% in 2020, and then a turnaround, hopefully the situation improving with COVID of 8.8. GDP per capita of this country is around $7,961, placing us as an upper middle income country. Inflation is quite well managed, as you can see, which translates into a very favorable and competitive cost of borrowing. You will see that our key exports are basically from the mining sector. You will see later predominantly diamonds, and that our population is quite relatively small when you talk about regional comparators. But you will see how we have put in deliberate strategies to make sure that we are an enabler for the region despite our small population. This is just to say Botswana tends to pursue a regional strategy, strategies that effectively link our priority sectors with regional value chains, which is why we are actively pursuing auto components manufacturers. This slide basically gives a gist of the bilateral, multilateral trade agreements that Botswana would have entered into, which basically will show you that producing from Botswana, you are quite able to access all these broad and lucrative markets. SADC, as a member of the SADC Trade Protocol, we do enjoy favorable access to the more than 293 million consumers. We are a member of SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, which also gives us duty-free, quota-free access to South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, and Swaziland. So that's how we really remove any sort of hiccups in flowing our goods and merchandise into these identified markets. Under SACU, there are sub-arrangements, as you can see, the SACU EFTA, that is for SACU countries with what we call European Free Trade Area countries of Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. And then SACU also has another arrangement with the Mercosur countries in South America. We are a beneficiary under AGOA, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act of the United States of America. We have special arrangements with Zimbabwe, and now we are becoming an active member with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So the essence of this slide is to say, if you choose to come and produce in Botswana, you have unfettered access to almost all the corners of the world through this agreement. And we share there some websites, URLs, where you can go and confirm the details of such arrangements. You will excuse me, I see I have a bit of a freeze. Slides not moving. Just try and fix that. All right. Sorry about that. This slide basically presents our principal commodity exports as Botswana. You will see that we are a country that is still predominantly exporting diamonds, constituting 91%. The challenge here is that even as you try and infuse investment into the other alternative sectors, you will find that our diamond sector has also been significantly growing and entrenching itself. So its dominance is still there. And the challenge for this country is really to develop that export-led knowledge-based economy. And that is why we are now driving in opportunities in sectors like auto components. Here we're talking mainly commodity imports. You will see that there's still a distortion of diamonds. The reason being that we are an international diamond trading center. So diamonds from far countries where the BS has mining rights, like your Canada and others, are actually aggregated in Botswana and actually sold in Botswana. So that's why you see them on both imports and exports. But when you closely analyze the import bill, it really presents areas of significant opportunity where somebody can come in and invest, because you are talking about a very high level of consumption there. But you will see that predominantly we import a lot of fuel, a lot of food, a lot of vehicles and transport equipment. And this is where one is looking at a bit of substitution to make sure that we can domesticate some of this production. This slide basically gives us some of the value, compelling value proposition for Botswana, to say we are well known for sustained periods of positive economic growth, which we believe will rotate back as we anticipate figures for 2020 and then into the projections for 2021. This country is still still has a strong balance sheet with a net external creditor position. The reason being that, you know, this country subscribes to what you call prudential borrowing limits. At any given time, we cannot borrow more than 40% as a country of our national GDP. So that is why, even amongst the challenges of COVID and all that, we can lend a few adjustments in the monetary and fiscal policy, but will still remain within those prudential limits. We have a relatively good and stable workforce. As you can see, the literacy rate is 87.7%. As Martin said, we do have companies that are already operating in the auto components manufacturing sector. They have never found any struggle in finding suitable labor, a trainable workforce. So we do believe in that regard, it's a big tick. The other thing that really puts Botswana ahead of the lot is our investment grade sovereign credit ratings. We know that with the economic shakeups, as the advent of COVID takes effect, we know that this might be revised downwards, but to a large extent, we are still amongst the few countries in Africa that can boast of an A-grade sovereign credit rating. And then on corruption as well, well known and confirmed by Transparency International. as probably the least corrupt country on mainland Africa. But when you take the holistic Africa, probably second only to the Seychelles. This is now a presentation of companies that are already doing business in Botswana in the auto components manufacturing sector. You can see that by our standards, they are really creating opportunities for quite a sizable number of people. We are happy to see that some of these companies are really investing in growth as they secure new deals from the OEMs in South Africa. So that's why we believe we can entrench quite a good value proposition for more companies to consider the stable environment in Botswana with a view to plug it back. And then, as the ambassador said, we still see that a lot of auto components that are used in industry in South Africa are still imported from far-flung markets like Germany and others, Malaysia. So we do believe that there's an opportunity for nearshoring. And when we nearshore, we believe that Botswana has a compelling value proposition to put forward. I wanted to also highlight that, over and above these three companies I've highlighted, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Botswana, has also committed that during his term, he will develop and launch quite a sizable electric vehicle industry in Botswana. We are already seeing a few companies and our research institutions making strides in that regard to say, as this sector sort of evolves into the future, we should also claim our relevance. And beyond just these three companies, we should be seeing developments now on the electric vehicle side. Now, this one, no need to emphasize, I'm speaking to industry experts. It was just to share a few statistics that confirm that indeed a lot of these components are imported into South Africa from other markets, and this is where we can tap in to try and domesticate. Continuing with the value proposition regarding auto components is the issue of proximity and location of Botswana relative to the rest of SADC. We are right in the center and therefore by default very close to all the auto assembly plants, and that will be located in South Africa. And here we share some of the distances that have been confirmed. The companies that are already doing business in Botswana are not finding a lot of challenges in terms of the timely delivery of components as they are required anywhere by the OEMs. This one I won't dwell in because I know we will have more time to discuss in the panel, but it was just to also crystallize some of the priority sectors that this country has set itself in. We are now revising and really trying to perfectly prioritize given the lessons that we have learned out of COVID. So this is just for spare reading to say that beyond auto components manufacturing, there are a lot of value-added sectors that we are also putting forward, as you can see on the slide. This is one that one can maybe dwell on because it really puts Botswana forward as a competitive place from a probably cost point of view. Corporate tax in Botswana is still at 22%. We've recently, on the VAT side, revised from 12% to 14% with effect from April 2020. But what I want to emphasize is that the country has still found it fitting to incentivize certain sectors where we believe we can derive a lot of value. If you come into Botswana and fit the definition of manufacturing, which is where auto components are housed, you pay tax at 15%, corporate tax as 15%, as opposed to 22%. Then the other sectors that are housed in there will be what we call our International Financial Services Center, which we can expand at another time, our Innovation Hub, which is a science and technology related development park, our SPEDO region, which I will touch on in a short while, and our special economic zones. So you will see that while our tax rates are already so competitive in the region, we've still found it fitting to further incentivize because we know, we realize the need for attracting these other alternative industries to come and dilute the dominance of diamonds. One thing about Botswana is that we also have duty-free imports for importation of manufacturing and agricultural machinery. So that's another big advantage. Therefore, you will see that in the overall, Botswana's tax rate at 22% fares very favorably with the African average corporate tax, which is at 27.5%, and the global average, which lands at 23.57%. Now, going to incentives, where you see a red demarcation on the map of Botswana is a region called Spedu. It's a region that is anchored on a town called Silibe-Pikwe, which was historically a copper mining town. Due to challenges on the mine, a few years ago, the mine had to shut down. We almost landed with a ghost town because more than 6,000 people lost their jobs. Therefore, government had to think on their feet to say, how can we invest in sustaining the livelihood of the town? So immediately this town and the region as demarcated was declared a special economic zone. Therefore, coming with very aggressive tax rates for companies operating in manufacturing, tourism, and agriculture, which are the predominant sectors in that region. You pay there 5% corporate tax for the first 5 years, and then 10% thereafter. And then again, the other incentives that I earlier on articulated will tend to kick in. There are some rebates there and accelerated facilitation on border issues, as well as customs and value-added tax. So this is a region that is there, it's functioning, and has actually attracted lately a lot of interest from international investors. It is still enjoying a good proximity to the OEMs in South Africa. So if one is looking at investing in Botswana, but in a low-cost environment, we then put forward the Spedu region as one to consider. There's a township there, well-developed, modern lifestyle, all the amenities that one can think about. So from a lifestyle perspective, there won't be any challenge. Now, this slide also presents that beyond the Spedu region, Botswana has a number of demarcated special economic zones. I think there will be 8 in number, and they are really taking shape. If we move on, you will see around our international airport in Gaborone, construction has started of what you call a mixed-use special economic zone. And the interesting thing here is that auto components manufacturing is accommodated. So somewhere in the middle of this year, we should be seeing quite sizable projects deployed there, because currently, government was deploying the underlying infrastructure. They codenamed the project Boulevard 1. Therefore, if one is really looking at coming into Botswana to take advantage of all the desirable attributes, here is a park which is dedicated to also hosting auto components manufacturers, and we do believe it will generate interest as we go forward. Now, these are the proposed incentive packages for that special economic zone once it's established. There again, 5% corporate tax for the first 10 years now, not 5 years like Spedu, and then you will be paying 10 years thereafter. There will be fast-track land allocation and on very long-term leases. For example, what we are envisaging, what has been approved, awaiting commencement, is a 99-year lease to land. So we believe it's something that investors should be attracted by and should be interested in taking up. And then there will also be a 25% waiver on any charges and fees around acquisition of state land, and then 0 rating for VAT. So for spare reading, again, this is the value proposition that our purpose-built special economic zone, the first one in Botswana that we are really putting forward, will be providing. Now, on the energy sector again, which is one area of concern by companies like auto components manufacturers, is that while we've been challenged like everybody else in the region, there is a lot of investment in moving towards power self-sustenance. Currently, the energy demand in Botswana ranges from 500 to 600 megawatts, currently supplied from domestic coal power stations based in the center of Botswana, mainly in Palape. We've had some old power stations that have been refurbished, for example, Murupule A, and it's contributing now an additional 132 megawatts. We've had our challenged project, Murupule B, which is now undergoing remedial works, and I think the first unit has been successfully completed as of last week. So we do believe that by end of 2023, Botswana will be fully self-sustaining in terms of power production. On the renewable energy side, again, if you look at the bulleted points down below, you will see that we have, while we are blessed with abundant coal, and therefore thermal power becomes the obvious choice, we've also developed a very good appetite as a country to now go into clean energy. And there are a number of projects that have started, and some are still lined up in the solar front, as well as the coal bed methane front, to come and further complement our power production. So there is a plan in that regard. Going to the institution that I represent, the Botswana Investment and Trade Center is our name. If you come into Gaborone, this very building that you see on the picture is exactly where we are located. This is our head office. You can't miss it because it's quite unique in our CBD. That's where you find us. We are the main agency of government that is mandated to attract and facilitate investment into Botswana. So if at all anybody attending today will be interested in making an inquiry on what we have said here, what we wouldn't have covered in the panel, and how they actively deploy on this particular sector of auto components, as well as any other sector, we are the people to go to. We are the national one-stop shop, and this is the bouquet of services that we facilitate: company and business registration, trade and business license applications, industrial and commercial land, as I said, as well as securing factory space, opening of bank accounts, telecoms and utility connections, facilitating incentives, environmental impact assessment, entry visas, work and residence permits and exemptions, VAT registration and tax exemptions, aftercare services. So this is the bouquet of services. The whole idea is that when you come to Botswana, you shouldn't find yourself having to scatter all over across town, trying to seek services from individual service providers. You come to BITC, we are the ones that know our ways around. We will be able to secure you all these things while you are seated. The person that you will ever see is ourselves and nobody else. So here we were just highlighting some of the reputable companies that we partner with in promotion of the country. We know that as investors, you would usually make a call on professional advisory firms like Deloitte when you are seeking to make your location decisions. That is why we are actively partnering with Martin Davies and the Deloitte team, because they are well empowered in terms of what Botswana offers as a value proposition. And on an ongoing basis, we do register a lot of investment through such. So these are the companies that we actively work with in promoting, and they are the ones who can also channel you back to us. Some of our international financial services center accredited companies, not only in auto components, I've already highlighted companies in auto components, but just to say some of the regional reputable brands are currently located in Botswana, and the whole idea is to try and extend this presence, have a critical mass, and diversify our economy from over-reliance on diamonds. With those few remarks, and knowing that we will extend the discussion in the panel, I thank you very much, and I share with you all those contact details. We do have an office in South Africa, headed by Mr. Bobo Senosi, who is indicated there. Please feel free to engage him further after this session on the contact details provided. We also have the embassy. Her Excellency, the Ambassador, has just addressed you. You can also utilize them at our offices, embassy offices in South Africa. I submit, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Carl, thank you very much, and thanks for the great presentation. Can I invite all the other panelists, please, to the conversation? Just put on your videos, please, and we can go straight into it. And Ross, just the slides, please. Okay, everybody. The intention is, well, we will be having a panel discussion now with some real experts, in their field, who will be able to sort of comment and give their views. and share experiences around the opportunities and challenges around creating deeper automotive value chain in Botswana. In the invitation, I'm not going to introduce everyone in detail. You have their bios that was supplied to all people who registered for this session. In the interest of time, please, I'm not going to repeat them, so you do have them on record. But if I may, firstly, maybe just, this is very interactive, and I'm going to jump around to Renee, please. Firstly, Renee Multilateral, who's the Executive Director of the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers, NACAM, which is the leading sort of industry body in South Africa. Renee, if I can invite you to open the conversation, please, you represent the value chain effectively in South Africa and this part of the world. You've been very active with the AAAM as a member, and we've worked very close together in recent times on this exact subject. Renee, from your perspective, just maybe set the scene by saying, what's the state of industry currently? What's the thinking of automotive component manufacturers, particularly in this day of COVID-19 and the significant market negative impact we had in 2020? We're still in a somewhat subdued market in 2021. There will be growth, but from obviously a much lower base. But what's the state of industry? What are component manufacturers thinking? And what are the opportunities perhaps around sort of shifting of the supply value chain, not just in South Africa, but perhaps the region? Renee, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Martin, to you and your team for having myself, and I suppose my organization, like you mentioned, NACAM is the Industry Association for Component Manufacturers in the country. I must say I really enjoyed the introductory remarks from both Mr. Olabile and High Commissioner Modise, because I think it aligns with the thinking not only of, I suppose, my own organization, but the wider automotive, let's call it industry body or grouping of stakeholders in South Africa. If we cut to the chase, the reality is the future of this country and this region's automotive sector is highly dependent on growing an industrial outcome across the continent. And it just makes sense that it sort of ignites in our neighboring countries. And I mean, to the point around the opportunity for component manufacturing, the companies that were shown during the presentation as having invested in Botswana are all South African based or extensions of South African companies. And that's just a very micro example of how an industrial hub, which South Africa is, can spread value chain benefits in the region. And I suppose that is an illustration of what we are as stakeholders trying to achieve and position for in the wider African context. Martin, you were talking about the work being done by AAAM and the concept of an African automotive industrialization pact is really going to be key to unlock what AAAM and, like I said, the wider stakeholders, both from public and private sector, want to see for this industry. So I'll start at that point and say, as component manufacturers, we are firmly behind the drive for industrialization and spreading industrial opportunity, especially, like I said, starting with our immediate region in the SACU economies. State of the sector, I mean, you kind of hit it on the head. Interestingly, the South African auto sector and especially its domestic prospects had gone into a bit of a slump even before COVID. The numbers were not great from a domestic vehicle sales perspective, and COVID exacerbated that situation. We have seen in the last, let's call it quarter of last year and moving into the first quarter of this year, significant growth, especially in export numbers. So the opportunity and the volume of supply for the majority of component manufacturers who are supplying onto platforms that get into export markets have currently experienced a resurgence of sort, but that does not take away from the fact that the industry industry really kind of hemorrhaged during the course of 2020. So I suppose in the short term, it seems as if there is a recovery underway. Global economic kind of outlook does not guarantee that that's going to be a permanent situation. I mean, at what point does demand start falling off in global markets as well? So I think interesting time. Just to sum up my opening comment, it's also kind of fortuitous that we are going into, at least as South Africa, a new phase of policy implementation. The fact of the matter is the level of support that is found through South Africa and SACU tax arrangements or customs arrangements, otherwise known as the APDP, and the next phase being APDP2 starting July this year, has been tweaked to the extent that it disincentivizes OEMs from using excessive levels of imported content, and by extension then incentivizes local procurement, which in theory should benefit all participants who are bound by the customs arrangements of SACU. And I'm deliberately phrasing it that way because APDP, as much as people think of it as a South African program, yes, it's a South African based incentive program, but due to the customs arrangement, the benefits flow through to all SACU members, including Botswana, and that's the reason why it makes sense, in addition to all of the other value prop that was shown earlier, but it also makes sense for component companies to be within SACU as they continue to contribute in terms of value-added incentivization to OEM value chains. So let me stop there, Martin. I think that was a fair.
Thanks, Renee. I'll come back to the APDP comment shortly, but if I can bring Celestine into the conversation. Celestine Global is the executive for strategy and business planning at Isuzu, which obviously is has a very long-term presence in South Africa and manufacturing presence here as well. Celestine, from your perspective, your views on the topic of sort of shifting value chains, particularly now post-COVID-19, and the value proposition that Botswana is offering that Kel's very eloquently set out. Celestine, thank you. I'll bring you to the conversation, please.
Thank you, Martin. I first of all want to thank Mr. Olebile for his opening remarks and Her Excellence Memodise. I think that was quite enlightening. I think as a manufacturer, this is quite an interesting time and exciting time, because if I look at some of the challenges that we have, deepening localization and increasing our local content, that is one of the big challenges because it impacts on our ability to hedge on FX, creating jobs, especially when we look at the amount of imports that we bring in as componentry. So the proposition that Botswana brings to the table is actually quite exciting. My colleague Renee spoke about APDP and Botswana being part of the collective when we look at the SACU region. So with the developments in Botswana to bring in local content, bring in some of the parts that they intend developing, I think it embraces or it contributes towards our objective of increasing the local content. And then we as Isuzu, or maybe some of the manufacturers as well, would benefit from that, because that would obviously increase the local content and then hedge on the FX that sometimes becomes a huge challenge when you import local content, when you import material from other regions that are not part of the customs union. So this is quite exciting, and from the Isuzu perspective, we are quite supportive and we'll be looking forward to this development.
Celestine, thank you very much. Dave, just bringing yourself in. Dave, you're a GM for purchasing at Nissan South Africa. Dave, you have had, building on what Celestine mentioned, you do have experience in Botswana. From Nissan's perspective, Kels also was talking about the distance of what 370 odd kilometers between Rosslyn, where you are, and obviously the special economic zone where Botswana is having an automotive cluster developing. Dave, from your perspective, experiences, views, observations, as opening comments, please. Thank you.
So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Let me recognize Her Excellency and Mr. Olabile, and my colleagues or panel on the panel. Yeah, so at present, so Nissan South Africa actually supports one of the companies that was highlighted at the beginning through the decks. We were involved with having many meetings with the BITC in setting this company up many years ago. Proximity, if I look at what Botswana has to offer, where we are located, proximity, it's a 2-hour or 300k drive. The company is just on the other side of the border. Unfortunately, I don't think they form into one of the economic zones as mentioned. So they have received some benefit in the setup, but the continued benefit might start becoming a problem. Labor and the literacy of the labor, I must say, in my visits up into Botswana is extremely good, well disciplined. I concur with the previous presenters regarding the minimum or no corruption that's taking place. There's lots of space available. These are some of the, I think,
good afternoon, good morning.
Good or
sorry, I think it's Roland. Did you mind? Okay. Mute button on, please. Sorry, Dave. Please carry
on.
Dave's on mute. Yeah.
Right. So, of course, Botswana is also considered local content. So these would be all some of the positives that Botswana brings to the table. I'm very excited to see that there's more discussions on the go with regards to what type of support structures and incentives the Botswana government has to offer. I think this is one of the key items from a strategy point of view to break this free. Wherever you see high levels of automotive supply chain, it goes hand in hand with support from government. So any regions that have succeeded with high levels of local content and high levels of volume, the Thailands of the world, the Japans of the world, Europe's, they've all got some kind of support mechanisms relating or filtering down or back up from government. And this is one of the key things that we need to convert good words into solid actions to make sure it's delivered. And we, through this mechanism, bring in companies, because companies come seeking profit ultimately. And this is what the package needs to present, is how do you convince somebody to establish themselves and have a sustainable operation. As an automotive company, we bring life cycles of 5 to 7 years. So it's let's say a 7-year program with consistent volume and offtake. I say that tongue in cheek with our recent experience of COVID, obviously, but in a normal environment, we have a very reliable and sustainable volume that's given. So you can predict for 7 years of the model life, a very stable overhead recovery. But what else needs to be going into those organizations to make it a sustainable operation? So that would be my.
Sorry, Dave, I think you're on mute there. Ross, can you just sort that out, please? Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know where you got me to. I said that's about it for summary or introduction from me. I've got many other points that I'm sure we will discuss as the panel as we go forward.
Right, Dave, thank you very much. I want to come back to you shortly on sort of labour productivity, particularly of labour, and how do we draw comparisons between South Africa. It's not so much about the cost of labour per se; it's more about the productivity thereof, and something which I'd like to chat about. But before that, Harsha, you, as I mentioned earlier, Harsha is a senior manager at Deloitte Strategy and Operations, and has been heavily involved in this study we did for the World Economic Forum. Harsha, your observations, particularly on Botswana, shifting value chains, fourth industrial revolution, something which is sort of your day job these days, and what does it mean for Botswana going forward? Your thoughts, please.
Thanks, Martin. I think what's exciting about what Botswana is doing is I think it's starting to show us what the Auto Pact in its full in its infancy, what it can achieve, especially with the collaboration that started between South Africa and Botswana from a value chain point of view. And I think it's got the makings of a really good, effort to try and bring the value chain integration to work. And I think there's opportunities to start with Namibia announcing its new manufacturing line as well, opportunities to build on that relationship. I think what's important is, you've highlighted, Martin, around the fourth industrial revolution, is really starting to think about what are the skills that we're going to need as we start shifting and thinking about the way we need to produce and what we're going to need to produce for the vehicles and mobility of the future. And I think that's something we must, don't think it's happening 10 years from now, it's happening today. And also think about how does that allow production in Botswana to become more competitive. I also just want to pick up a comment, if it's okay, from the earlier conversation around the local content aspect. And I think one of the things we really need to foster if we want to make this Auto Pact work in the region is to be able to understand that we need to produce and drive local content where it makes competitive sense to do so. So as much as we're trying to use industrialization, as you indicated, Martin, earlier, to support the development agenda around industrial and using industrialization as a lever to do that, we need to appreciate that that's only going to happen when we are able to be globally competitive. So while we drive that local content agenda, let's make sure that we drive the local content agenda where it's competitive to do so. So I think that's going to be really important. And perhaps in light of the time and all the other questions, I want to perhaps hand back to you, Martin, and say thank you to the High Commissioner, Mr. Olubile, and all the panelists. I think we're really getting into a nice discussion.
Thanks, Harsha. There's a couple of questions I've seen in the chat, some general, some private, and there's one come through here. Kels, to yourself, and it's a bit of a tricky one because it talks to what I said earlier about public policy. And what's the Botswanan government's thinking? Because again, it comes to the key thing of balancing trade policy. Of course, we are, after all, living in an era of freer and more liberalized trade in Africa. This, from external at least, results in what many call as dumping of product into countries, not into South Africa, but into Botswana and other neighboring countries. So on the one hand, you're trying to industrialize a value chain in auto. The other one, there's very sort of cheap imports coming in, significantly lesser priced imports and often lesser quality, no emissions controls, no homologation, etc., into the market. How do you balance these two issues? And what's the thinking of Botswana around so-called grey imports and local manufacturing? Kels, any comment there, perhaps?
Thanks, Martin. I think these are issues that the government of Botswana is taking quite seriously. Particularly on the grey imports. If you were following our budget speech, you will see that there's going to be quite a levy on second-hand imported vehicles, particularly to respond to the very issues of pollution, maybe overwhelming of our roads because of the volume and the trend in which these vehicles are coming through. So I would say that, yes, for attracting real value-adding operators like the auto components we are targeting in South Africa, there is already a thought of how we can kind of protect and make sure that they can come into a level ground competition without being overwhelmed by some of the realities that we see. So if you go to our last budget speech, which was read a few weeks ago, you will see that there are actually developments coming in that line.
Kel, thank you. And something else which you mentioned, Kels, earlier, I'm going to bring Renee into this, and a question as well was posed on this, is, Kels, you mentioned electric vehicles. Now, this is something which is quite far over horizon for most of this part of the world. But if you're in China, if you're in Scandinavia, in the UK, maybe parts of the US, West Coast US, electric vehicle sales are growing at significantly high rates. How, Renee, is the local industry, think South Africa here, with spillover into Botswana, from a components perspective? I'm thinking, I think this could happen sooner than we may think. How is our broader components industry thinking about the change in powertrain from an internal combustion engine to electric vehicles? What impact will this have on the automotive industry? And how should countries, ourselves, Botswana, all under the ambit of the APDP, as you said, be thinking about technological change and how countries think about this in terms of their industrialization strategies?
Martin, thank you. Interesting question. I think let's first consider that we have a benefit in the current structure of the industry in South Africa, and probably no different to other emerging growing nodes of vehicle production. I mean, South Africa's got a long history of vehicle production, so we're not really emerging, but we fit, I suppose, in the competitive space of countries like Thailand, Mexico, Turkey, and the like. The fact that we are so multinational dominated, especially at a tier one supplier base, has some disadvantages in terms of the depth of our supply of our value chain. But the fact that we are so heavy with multinationals does give some view that preparedness for whatever the technology is that is required by the OEM plants in the country will be migrated into the country, whether it's skills or capital technology. I think the overarching point is that whether it's ICE or whether it's EVs, technology is changing and adapting at a very rapid pace. So the benefits that come from being part of a global value chain will eventually find itself infiltrating into the EV space once the ecosystem for EV manufacture in South Africa kind of takes root. I think we should also understand that if we talk purely EVs, it's not just about the battery technology or the power to run the vehicle. The EV will have a range of components that is, I suppose, to some extent common to other forms of vehicle production, but probably needs production at different specs. So, I mean, if you take something like suspension products, I've been told that the battery of an EV is of a significantly higher weight and increases weight of the overall vehicle, meaning suspension springs, for example, have to be at a different grading or tensile. The fact that we've got those kind of manufacturers in the country already positions us to say that should EV production start happening in the country, these companies will have to adapt their grading of production accordingly. So it's not as if we're saying things are all kind of hunky-dory and should there be an EV plant tomorrow, everyone is ready for it. I think it will be a kind of evolution into the space. What is really important, and I think whenever we talk about EVs, is to start getting that ecosystem going in the country, ensuring that there's sufficient demand for EV products. We've kind of gone backwards in the space over the last couple of years, and we really need to try and stimulate that to catch up with the kind of vehicles that are going to be supplied into traditional markets going forward. In the short term, there's probably an opportunity for us to pick up some of the ICE production that may be being kicked out of traditional markets. Again, when we link to that discussion, the important point here is what we were speaking about earlier and restricting the used or the grey imports into our markets. So the point by Mr. Olabile, for me, that is just a fundamental move that has to happen within SACU, because Dave and Celestine will tell you, localization, it's purely about volume. It's a volumes game. It can be a whole range of incentives, and they are, and there will be more from what I understood. But without volume for the product, you kind of permanently pushing uphill. And it will be the same in the EV scenario. As more and more countries start banning ICE vehicles from their markets, those used vehicles will have to find their way somewhere. And the last thing we want is for them to be penetrating SACU markets. So Martin, I think as a sector, the decision by the UK last year to move forward their own ban, I think up to 2030, has definitely made us sit back and say, hey, you know what, this thing is coming quicker than we may have thought 2 years ago. Traditional markets that South Africa exports its vehicles to are starting to put some restriction on that. Either we find new markets for those vehicles, or we also start getting ourselves into the EV ecosystem. So for me, it's really important that we put the infrastructure and the policies in space that starts making EV a commonly used vehicle segment in the country.
Got it. Thanks, Renee. Celeste, coming back to yourself, just two-part question, building on what Renee just explained. Firstly, from a tech perspective, how are you as Isuzu thinking about technological change, particularly from, I'm thinking about your operation in South Africa, your operation I think you have in East Africa and Kenya as well. How is technological change, will it happen sooner than we expect around EV and powertrain replacement, etc.? Or will Africa take significantly longer? 2030, Renee mentioned as a UK, all EVs, new cars sold post 2030 will be EVs of some sort or other. We may be, that may be further down the line for us, but from a tech perspective, what are your views from an OEM's, Isuzu's view? And secondly, Celestine, was mentioned earlier about the APDP. How you obviously look at the APDP very closely, carefully, and maybe your view as to how a country like Botswana, through the SACU arrangement, could also benefit or enhance investment prospects through the APDP and through participation in this program. Celestine, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. I think on a tech development perspective, that's a very interesting dynamic, because technology is rapidly changing, and Isuzu is also not immune to that. Interestingly, we had our strategy discussion end of last year, and we embraced that technology is going to be one of the key areas that we're going to be focusing on. And this is not only looking at our R&D center in Japan, but this is also looking at South Africa and some of the business units in Africa. So we are looking at Kenya, we are looking at potentially in Ghana. So when we look at those centers, we are not looking at the legacy processes. We are constantly looking at these new technologies that are emerging and how we can embrace them so that we drive the efficiencies in our value chains. So when we also look at the full value chain, we are looking at how best we can bring in this technology advancement in our supplier base, because that will feed through our manufacturing footprint, and it will also feed through into responding to what our customer base is looking at. Because the technology and what the customers are also looking at, it's sort of interlinked and intertwined. So what the customer is looking at and hopefully seeing as a differentiator in what product they go to has to be embraced in either our product development or when we look at the suppliers developing the componentry. So having said that, technology is one of our strategy pillars, and we are looking at ways and means of accelerating that and keeping abreast with all the other developments that are happening in and around the value chain. On APDP, I think critical to that, again, Renai spoke to that, and Harsha maybe to some extent spoke to that when you look at local content. As much as we have these incentive structures being built around local content, job creation, I think what is also critical is ensuring that there is efficiency and you can drive profitability along those innovations. So looking at the development in terms of the supplier base in Botswana, I think one of the core pillars of the APDP is to look at achieving a 60% local content by 2035. So with Botswana coming into the value chain, I think that will assist in achieving that core pillar of increasing or developing the local content. But as we develop that local content, I think again, it's critical that we are more competitive in the global perspective, because that is what now creates the volume and the sustainability. So if we don't have the critical mass and compete at a global level, that becomes a huge challenge, and then it impedes on our ability to meet on the targets of the APDP. So I think we need to look at this value chain, how we develop it in growing the suppliers in Botswana, looking at the incentive structure, but core to that is ensuring that we have the critical mass, we compete at a global level, and we have more sustainable operations that can evolve over time rather than at a specific point in time.
Listen, thank you. I want to come back. There's a few questions coming through. I'll address those shortly, but coming back to Dave from Nissan. Dave, speaking about productivity and labor, the financial incentives which Cal set out are very attractive. The tax rates, the tax holidays, the location is very strategic and well positioned. With the incentives through the zones, etc. From a labor productivity perspective, your observations around that from a training perspective, is labor as productive as it needs to be, can be? How does it compare to South Africa? That's sort of the key question. Dave, your views, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dave.
All right, good. So just to, I think that the best way to answer that is, I'll give you my view, but it's important that I think the Botswana government spends time at the Gemba. So I don't know what forums exist within Botswana where there is at least, I don't know, quarterly or every 6 months, some kind of shop floor level meeting where there's a meeting with the CEOs and those types of the current incumbents within Botswana to understand what are their challenges and what are their experiences, because there's a lot of information there that can be gleaned if properly listened to and properly actioned. So from a productivity point of view, I would say that the literacy rate is very, very high within Botswana. So that's a plus point. I think the actual labor rates is also very competitive from a Botswana point of view. So there's two very, very good points. I do, however, the feedback I receive from my supplier is they've got very, very strong labor laws in the country, and the labor law protects very much the labor. So when we went through COVID, it was very, very easy for a South African supplier to be able to flex and work, or even when we do have a blip in our supply chain and it's not due to COVID, our local suppliers have the ability to flex with our requirements with regards to labor. a Botswana company in Botswana does not have the same flexibility that a South African supplier is able to benefit from. So that's when you compare directly to South Africa. Then I can go even broader than that, where even I think in South Africa we could possibly learn. When we look at our colleagues in Thailand, the way labor packages are structured and supported with their labor laws, it automatically builds efficiency and productivity into the cycle. So they've got a base salary, which is very, very, very competitive, unbelievably competitive in Thailand. You wouldn't think that somebody can survive on that level of pay. But on top of that, they've got incentivized bonuses. So if you are on track with your volumes for the hour, you will get so much. For the second hour, so much. For the third hour, so much. If your quality output is at the correct level, you get incentivized. And so it goes on. So by the time you get to the total package, they're getting paid similar to our rates. But there's so much incentivization going into it that they are extremely productive, with high quality, with high efficiency. And these are the type of things that we need to learn on the African region. Does that answer your question, Martin?
Dave, that's great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dave. There's a question for, and I'll direct it to Kelisitse, from Peter Webb. Peter Webb runs a company called Datadot here in the South African region. The question is, you mentioned that Botswana was planning to embark on an electric vehicle industry. Is this vehicle manufacturer or components that feed therein? Kels, your views, please.
Thank you, Martin. I think in terms of what we intend to do is to build the industry and its ecosystem. So the companies that I spoke about are mainly aiming at developing an electric vehicle, but we are also approaching this at multiple models. It's not about originating a vehicle that has been planned and structured in Botswana. We've also been active in going around people that have developed, going around the world, courting people that have developed prototypes, as well as maybe just concepts or designs of an electric vehicle that we believe can be scaled up and maybe tested and introduced in the region to consider coming to locate in Botswana. And obviously through our special economic zones and other dispensations, we could see how those can be incentivized. But so far, as I said, there is a company near Gaborone here that has developed its own prototypes. This is a company that has been existing for a number of years, producing buses for our armed forces. So they already have the technology and all that. So on the promise and the call by the president, they took up the opportunity and said, let us develop something in this regard. Currently, their prototypes are open to the public for testing and also trying to, generate that interest by default demand. And then at one point, they believe they'll commercialize. So to answer the question, it's the vehicle and the whole ecosystem, because once you have it, once you get it accepted across the region, you are now talking the same ecosystem with auto components manufacturers and other finer components that will ultimately make an electric vehicle.
Kel, thank you. Coming harsher to yourself is what's been mentioned a few times is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has been in place now for what? 6 weeks. It's early days, but it holds out. There's much runway of potential here. How should countries be thinking about the potential that the free trade agreement holds out, and what does this mean for the automotive sector? And this was sort of the sweet spot of your recent work.
So yeah, I think, sorry, go for it, Kelly, first.
Go ahead.
Sure. So I think I would talk about it in two parts. One, I think, is to be able to appreciate that the free trade agreement is a policy on paper, and it's going to be as good as what we make it out to be. So what that means is, in order to start operationalizing it, what we really need to think about is making sure that we almost create it in an evolutionary structure. And so one of the key parts that we were able to gain from the research that we did is it's quite broad in its current stance, and we need to think about what is the interpretation for the automotive sector. How do we look at specific regions producing specific components, and what does that mean in terms of the way we facilitate trade? And when we're thinking about that, let's make sure that we think about it from an evolutionary mechanism. So we can't get the mechanics of it right at the very beginning, but what we need to say is what is the base, so that it makes it attractive for countries across the region to be investing in production capability, to participate meaningfully in trade, in automotive and across other sectors. And I think part of that then is being able to say, how would we sort of gradually progress that level of maturity across the region in the manner in which we trade? And that's going to be supported, not by, this one multilateral trade, but as we've seen before, the several bilaterals that we have in order to support the execution. So the second point is on the execution part. I think at a policy level and a principle level, there's a large consensus. Everybody wants to make this work. I think what is hard in Africa in particular is, I think we've seen some of the gains around helping to improve our customs clearance types of processes in order for the movement of goods between different locations. I think what we need to do is make sure that we embed those in a way that's going to be sustainable to support effective movement of goods. What I think is particularly going to be more challenging is our logistics to support that. So what we really need to think about is, how do we facilitate trade in a way that's going to be cheaper, consider the safety of the movement of those goods and the quality as those goods are moved. So I think one of the things we really need to think about in order to facilitate this at the scale at which we want is, how do we create the right kind of logistics mechanisms? And we can embrace technology like digital supply networks to create, to open up our view around the movement of goods from one to the other, and start understanding how the physical and the digital start connecting, so that it better informs the entire planning and distribution process. And so, as we start doing this, from one supplier base to one OEM, how do we start facilitating that on a grander scale, in a way that supports the more regional competitiveness that we are trying to aim for, in order to support our positioning to be globally competitive. So I think those are probably the two main aspects that I think would be very important, and being able to appreciate that as we drive that localization agenda, it needs to facilitate the regional agenda as well.
Thanks, Asha. Kel, sorry, you wanted to add to that?
No, that's fine, Martin. I think Asha covered it very well. From the Botswana perspective, what we normally do when we have these multilateral trade arrangements is to develop a very specific response strategy to say, how do we work as a country to make sure that, number one, we maximize our benefits, but number two, within the environment that we are in, for example, are there any countries that we should be engaging where probably the level of commitment to such a bilateral or multilateral is not at that level? So for dispensations like AGOA, for example, you find that we have a purpose-built strategy defined on the ground, which everybody follows in terms of maximizing access into such a market. And we are looking forward with great excitement to the Africa continental.
Thanks, Kels. There's a question here. It's a bit of a tough one. Maybe Celestine, from an OEM perspective, you have the answer from Brian from Driven Magazine, talking about sort of a few manufacturers, OEMs have dealerships already operating in Botswana, and Botswana allowing for automotive industry to expand. How will this growth impact the sole-owned dealerships that are already established in Botswana, the likes of Automotive, etc.? Celestine, maybe a little bit local perhaps, but do you have a view on that perhaps from an OEM view?
I think ultimately it boils down to the scalability of that investment within Botswana. So today we might have, let's say, one dealership in Gaborone because of the volume throughput that we are selling in Botswana. But when you look at growth and that market growing, you could potentially look at growing your dealer footprint. So I think as the economy grows, as the volume grows, there is opportunity to grow the dealer network within the specific market. So I don't think the initiative to look at growing the supplier base will impede the growth on the other activities in the value chain. I think it's very complementary, where you see increase in supplier base, increase in expenditure within that market, driving volume growth, and then you need a bigger footprint to distribute the product.
Celeste, just stay for a second. I don't want to maybe push this a little bit hard. Maybe it's not. Excuse me for being provocative, but you mentioned you have one dealership in Gabs. How much of a problem, and this, don't just talk specifically from my Susu's perspective, let's look at it from an OEM's perspective here. How much of a problem or not are dumped vehicles, low-cost vehicles coming into the markets? And ultimately, we want formalization here. We want dealerships, decent servicing, homologation issues, and that creates a significant number of downstream jobs in the automotive sector, just through creating dealerships with decent servicing, and the whole value chain becomes arguably more professional, more certain, and more formalized. How much of a disincentive is it to you from for OEMs from a manufacturing perspective, and also perhaps only formal retail outlets? Dumped cars, your comment, please, in terms of preventing expansion of a formal automotive sector in a country like Botswana.
Martin, that's a very important comment. If you look at policy stability or policy sustainability in the different sort of hubs that we're looking at developing in the Africa continent, that is a key enabler in ensuring that the policy is sustainable, that the policy is stable, and the policy is successful. Because when you build vehicles in a market, and you have the so-called dumping of refurbs and used vehicles, that distorts your ability to grow that market. Because some of your dumped vehicles can be landed at a negligible pricing compared to your ex-works when you build a vehicle in the factory or so. So in all the markets that we are seeking to develop the auto policy and ensure that there is stability, the component of ensuring that the anti-dumping element within the policy is also included is so much ventilated. So looking at the Botswana scenario, as we develop the packages of incentives, if we are to build a viable auto industry, I think the anti-dumping policy has also to be enshrined within that incentive structure, so that you create the critical mass of the local assemblers, and thereby ensuring that the local supplier base also has the ability to grow the volume to support the assemblers. So that is quite key to ensure that the policy is successful.
Listen, thank you very much. We're nearing time, in fact, but maybe a couple of concluding words. Dave, from your side, Nissan outlook, thinking vis-a-vis Botswana, what are your concluding thoughts, please?
So I would say learn. There's 3 ways to learn, and I mentioned one of them is at the shop floor. Get the information from where you are already. Another way to learn is from history. History says you had a massive operation up there in the form of Hyundai many years ago. Why did that not succeed? Have we unpacked that to understand properly and make sure that we got countermeasures? And the third element to learning is benchmark. what are other countries doing to attract industry, and how can Botswana do that better? Because that's the race, is you need to be better than anybody else. We are on a continent that is seen as the next big boom when it comes to the automotive sector. Every other region is well developed, so it's only natural that it needs to come into Africa sometime. So the people to take the hard actions first and not make just wallpaper, but actual demonstrate the hard actions, I think those people will win. And I think there's a lot of information within the companies already operating there. In my discussions there, looking at becoming more efficient, Botswana being landlocked, how do you make your borders more efficient? How do you work with other borders, like more to the west, to make them more efficient, to bring in product from Europe at much cheaper rates? I think there's a lot that can be done, and all of these jewels or nuggets are lying within the industries already in Botswana that they keep on telling me, but you need to spend time there and listen to them. That would be my closing words.
Okay, thank you. Renee, from your side, before I go to Kels for conclusion, Renee, please, your final thoughts on the value proposition of Botswana to deepen its automotive value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I'll be brief. Martin, the attendees have got my view on the importance of the market side of support for industrialization. The views around grey and used imports, well ventilated. I do think it could be interesting. I mean, clearly the value prop, like we hear, and if you combine that with being participants in the APDP type policies, shows that there's a fair amount of support from a supply side perspective. And some of the points that Dave made really important, continuously keeping up to a competitiveness culture and ensuring from a supply side, you kind of bulletproof. And I think that's within the agenda of the Botswana value prop from what we've seen. There could be some creativity around stimulating demand side. Again, coming back to a case of how do you ensure the Botswana consumer market picks up not only vehicles produced in South Africa, but the possibility of vehicles produced or assembled in South Africa with Botswana components, and in that way support an industrialization drive. So my concluding remarks is to keep doing what's happening on the supply side, but there's a lot of creativity and space to intervene on the demand side as well.
Renee, thank you very much. And final words before I give a super brief conclusion. Kels, from your side, Botswana government, BITC, the way forward, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think we can only say we are here. We are willing to engage, because at the end of the day, all the reforms that we can put forward that take the lead in propelling this industry forward can only be done in partnership with all the participants, OEMs and stakeholders participating in this forum. For the companies that are already on the ground, yes, we know them. As BITC, we run what we call an aftercare program. That is where we develop cycles of always going to at least the big strategic companies within the country, understand their issues, and then advocate back to government. So that is why, as we speak, the two companies, particularly that are in auto components, have been approached with a special economic zones incentive package. That is because our laws, going to an earlier point by Dave, our laws do not necessarily insist that you will only get the incentives when you are within the zoned area. There is what you call single factory status, which says that if you are of the right scale operating anywhere within the country, you will still be designated and be handled as such. So in closing, Martin, is just to say we are open. We've shared our contacts. We would like to continuously engage so that we can develop all the aspects of competitiveness and attract the critical mass of the value chain players in the auto industry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. From my side to conclude, Renee mentioned, Thailand was mentioned, and ultimately I think the value add, manufacturing value add, local content in South Africa, I think Renee, correct me, is 43%. I think somewhere like Thailand is nudging 2/3 of total, 63, not too far off 2/3 of total. And ultimately countries seek to, from a deepening of value chain perspective, and Dave set out exactly how they've done it from a productivity and labor perspective, is how do we get to Thailand? I think that's sort of the ultimate mission from a developing world context, and really deepening one's value chain of automotive. I think secondly is that, from as I started out earlier, high manufacturing value add, it really embeds IP in a country, and countries which are purely resource or often single resource driven economies almost always suffer from very high inequality in society. And high inequality, of course, is inequalities is the British of our time. Countries of high manufacturing value add tend to be far more equal societies. And that's something which was set out earlier as well in terms of what Renee said about how new manufacturing can really sort of drive a country forward in terms of embedded sustainable development. And the last comment is from Botswana. I think you're looking at a case, looking at the Asia examples and the African examples. In Asia, it was the small economies, the small, better governed, agile economies that led the reform agenda in Asia. Economies in countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea. It was the big economies, the laggards, India, China, which took a long time to catch up. You see small economies like Botswana, more agile, well-governed. Kels, you set it out very, very well, who ultimately capital will and should reward. And Botswana certainly is exhibit A when it comes to this in this regard. A country that is really stepping up, creating, as was spoken about, competitive advantage to latch onto a broader trend of automotive industrialization in our continent. Hel, thank you so much for your presentation. Much appreciated. It's a great conversation, and we will share this your deck and all the materials you have with all the participants, and as well as also send the World Economic Forum report we spoke about earlier on deepening automotive value chains in our part of the world. But I encourage everyone, thank you very much again for being part of this great conversation. It's very important for us, and thank you from Deloitte's perspective, and most importantly, thank you from Botswana. It's great, always great to work with friends and organizations across the border, for me at least, in your country in Botswana. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for participating, and please reach out to BITC for further information as well. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.